Does the eviction moratorium place an unfair burden on mom and pop landlords? All right, so I have an interesting article for you today coming from WAFB.com, and it says, eviction moratorium places an unfair burden on mom and pop landlords. Now, keep in mind, most of my videos, I go into detail exactly why the eviction moratorium is putting an unfair burden on mom and pop landlords. So I like reading articles like this because it's getting the word out there. Hey, we're struggling through this pandemic. We cannot hold on forever. We need help, or we need to end the eviction moratoriums, and that's it. So let's get into this article. As unemployment plummeted during the pandemic, both renters and landlords felt financial hardships. It's hard. We haven't gotten paid in 4 months now, says Sandra Dunaway. Dunaway owns rental properties in Baton Rouge area. She says she and her husband have nearly exhausted their savings account as they try to keep up with the mortgage payments, while their tenants continue to live rent-free. Imagine, you have saved up money for years, emergency reserves to cover a few months here and there of tenant turnover or maintenance or capital expenditures or whatever for your properties, and having to drain it all so that your tenants can live for free with no financial help from the government, with no anybody even caring about you. They just see you as this rich landlord who has this big piggy bank full of money, and that's just not the case in the grand majority of times. So it just feels like we're under attack a lot of the time from tenants' rights groups and the government and from everyone else. My husband was in fact unemployed from September to February 1st, and that's part of our income. We depend on that income. That's part of our retirement money, said Dunaway. She says her only option now is to sell the properties, but she will have to wait a little longer. The CDC has extended its order until June 30th, said Judge Yvette Alexander, Baton Rouge City Court. So yeah, this is another case where a landlord who has come to the conclusion that their only option is to sell the properties in order to get themselves out of this financial situation. I mean, that shouldn't be what's happening, but it is what's happening in a lot of cases. People think, oh, well, only a very small percentage of tenants are not paying their rent right now. And that is true. But 5% of tenants not paying any rent is enough to completely ruin the finances of landlord businesses, because a lot of landlord businesses operate on very thin margins, okay? Very thin. I can tell you for a fact that 90% plus of the money that I get for rent goes to the mortgage, goes to the insurance, goes to the property taxes, goes to utilities, goes for tenant turnover when those costs come up, goes towards capital expenditures, goes to maintenance, okay? So, all those things combined, I'm getting a very, very slim profit from each property every month. And if I don't get paid rent, just from a few of my units, all of a sudden my entire financial situation is just flipped upside down, and I'm going from making a little bit of money to losing money. And that's exactly what's happening to a lot of these small landlords. Judge Alexander says once a tenant provides a signed moratorium notice from the CDC, an eviction hearing will likely be dismissed. However, landlords do have the right to appeal if they believe a tenant is able to pay rent. If the landlord disputes it or thinks that something is not true in there, the burden of proof shifts to him to be able to prove it, which is very difficult, said Judge Yvette. Yeah, so you can challenge the tenant on, whether they actually are under a financial hardship, but how are you going to prove that as the landlord unless you can get down there and, or hire a private investigator or something to go follow this person around and show that they aren't under financial hardship? I mean, I just don't understand how a landlord could prove that sort of thing. The proof should be in the put towards the tenant, okay, to prove that they actually are, in a financial situation where they need rental help, okay? And if they are in that situation, then rather than just saying they can't be evicted, they should be provided providing rental assistance direct to the landlords. And that's just not what's happening in a lot of cities. Judge Alexander says while landlords generally do not dispute the cases, she urges renters to be honest. You could face jail time and penalties for lying under oath. It's not just I don't want to pay my rent, so here I am, I'm going to sit. That's not what it is meant to help people who have been hurt by COVID. And if you haven't been hurt by COVID, then you should not be taking advantage of your landlords. And yeah, I agree with that. You know, if you're not hurt by COVID, you shouldn't be taking advantage of your landlords. Yet that is exactly what's happening all over the country. I've got tons of stories just like this where tenants are taking advantage of the situation. They're not paying rent. They're not even communicating with a landlord. There might be rental assistance available. They're not applying for it. They're just sitting in there and doing nothing and expecting the landlord to continue to pay the bills indefinitely. And that's not right. The senators, the congressmen, the governor's office, I've talked to everybody I can think of to talk to. I've written letters and I've just kind of gotten nowhere. And they've even told me that I'm sorry you have just fallen through the cracks. So sometimes I do feel like I've been thrown overboard and not given a lifeline, says Dunaway. Dunaway says she applied for landlord assistance through the state but was denied, likely because the aid does not include East Baton Rouge, which has its own assistance program. According to the mayor's office, landlords are only eligible if the tenant applies and qualifies for the program. And there's a big kicker right there. Landlords are only eligible for the tenant relief if the tenant applies and the tenant is eligible for the program. So, basically, let's say the tenant isn't eligible for the rent relief, okay? So, the tenant, you know, they didn't lose their job or whatever, and they have no reason not to be paying their rent. They're not eligible for the rent relief. However, they are eligible for the eviction moratorium. Doesn't make any sense now, does it? But that's exactly what tenants are doing. They're getting away with not having to pay rent, and it's destroying a lot of small mom and pop landlords. Okay, so this next story is coming out of St. Louis, and it looks like a landlord went as far as they could in order to get rid of a bad tenant who wasn't paying during the eviction moratorium. And I gotta say, I'll give this landlord credit. I wouldn't have gone this far, but you know, you do whatever it takes in order to get your finances right, you know, within the law, of course. So let's get into this story. A St. Louis landlord called Fox 2 to tell our You Paid For It team that he was getting a raw deal under the city's eviction moratorium, and for the first time, the sheriff agreed with him. Sheriff Vernon Betts has the unenviable task of serving eviction notices and force families from their houses, but that job has been suspended because of the pandemic. St. Louis Circuit Court presiding judge Michael Stelzer barred most evictions. Yeah, just like most places in the country, St. Louis, they banned evictions from happening right now during the pandemic, and this landlord obviously has a bad tenant in there that they just can't get rid of, and you know, they're looking at any means that they can take in order to get rid of this tenant. Landlord Alan Shelton says his tenant won't pay. He says he no longer had money to keep making improvements on the building. To make matters worse, the pipes froze and water got on the electrical boxes, shorting out the power to the first floor tenant, who Alan says wasn't paying rent. When the city building inspector came, Shelton told him to just condemn the building. But the building inspector just condemned the second floor and not the first floor where the non-paying tenant lived. Wow. I mean, just telling the building inspector to just condemn the building. I mean, just it's condemned, you know, like it's not even livable anymore. So the tenant has to leave if the building isn't livable, right? I mean, that's pretty bad. Now, I know that there are a lot of very, very low quality properties in St. Louis, and I'm imagining that this is one of them. So back in the day, you used to be able to buy, you know, properties for like 20 grand in St. Louis. So it wouldn't surprise me one bit if this landlord just says, I'm just taking the loss. I'm not paying to keep this building up anymore. This tenant won't leave. I need them to leave. So, you know, let's just let this building be condemned and I'll be done with it. After our interview with Sheriff Betts, the building inspector came out and condemned the entire building. Shelton says it sounds drastic, but condemning the building was probably the only way to force out a non-paying tenant. Okay, so the eviction moratoriums obviously have caused a lot of problems for landlords. I haven't heard of many landlords going to this extreme in order to get rid of a tenant, but hey, you know, we're seeing a lot of crazy stuff happening nowadays.